Okay, we're recording. I'm going to say we're ready to go. So first off, thank you everybody for joining. So first I'm going to say that this event is organized by QTI Coalition of Color, a network of QTI of Color and Black QTI Cambridge in collaboration with Cam Queer History at the University of Cambridge. So my name is Eve. My pronouns are she, her. I'm located down in Munich, Germany, where I work with a group called Munich Feminist Project, doing a lot of intersectional feminist projects and outreach. And then I guess I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi there, my name is Jade. I'm currently based in Cambridge. I'm recently back from doing my master's in Vancouver in the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality and Social Justice. My research primarily engages with the limit and radical possibilities of arts-based activism being utilised by queer, racialised artists and activists working in Britain today. I'm kind of an activist scholar, like very much on the ground, which is informed by my scholarship.
Okay, cool. So first, it's actually nice to finally actually see you face to face. We just been emailing.
Absolutely.
Yes, so our topic today is pride and prejudice, underrepresentation in queer communities. So yeah, so I'm just gonna give an overview of like what our agenda for all the listeners. So basically, we'd like to sort of talk about obviously discrimination and exclusion in LGBT and queer communities. But also from a historical context. You know, we're starting back like the Stonewall Riots 51 years ago, and actually been going and everything leading up to now with how LGBT and pride has sort of like transformed over the years, and what we're kind of dealing with in a current day context. Yes. So Jade, I'm going to sort of prompt you occasionally with some questions, or you can even prompt me also. You can just like ping me back and forth. So I kind of wanted to talk about like the so historical context, you know, starting with the Stonewall Riots. Now, one of the things kind of saw we're kind of emailing back and forth, and something I have for myself is that with the Stonewall Riots, you know, a lot of people didn't actually even know about it before last year, you know, because it was like this is the big anniversary of it. You know, Marcia P. Johnson and Sylvia, they threw the first stones. Now, do you feel that with Marcia P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivers sort of becoming like the faces of it, do you find that like sort of tokenization and simplification of the riots themselves?
I absolutely do. I think that the miscontextualizing of Marcia's role in the uprising, it actually discredits her life and her presence, because there are interviews with her where she states, I didn't get there till 2. The fires were already ablaze.
Yes.
So when you have people running around, you know, like Marcia threw the first brick, Marcia threw the first rock, or it was a shot glass, it discredits the incredible role of her, because then people can call out the fact that, well, she said that she didn't. While we're on this topic, would you like me to continue my points on Marcia and Sylvie, or would you like to have some more questions?
I would say I'll run with it. I would like to be a little more organic. Like I'm only going to throw in questions when I feel we kind of need to like guide the discourse a bit, but please feel free to go as far as you want.
Okay. So I am seeing adoration of Marcia P. Johnson. I've seen it here in the UK, I saw it in Vancouver, and I've seen it when I've been traveling around. And I think what the predominantly white LGBTQ community refused to acknowledge is that Marcia and Sylvie actually lived very difficult lives, and they were outcast from the community by the predominantly white community. It needs to be acknowledged that they were asked not to march in gay pride. It needs to be acknowledged that there is footage of Sylvia being booed off of stage because the predominantly white gay men were stating that these drag queens are denting our image. I think that people that are celebrating them, it kind of falls in line with the celebration of the people depicted in Livingston's documentary Paris is Burning.
Yes.
Everyone wants to love these people as long as they can claim voguing as well. We need to remember it's very conditional. However, they don't want to examine the fact, why were these people on the piers? Why were so many of them living homeless? They don't want to maybe acknowledge how survival sex work was impacting their lives, and they also don't want to acknowledge the fact that they were outcast from both the racialized communities and the queer communities, so therefore had to almost create their own history and almost create their own identities.
Yeah. So I want to kind of like go off of that. So that's actually awesome because one of the things is like the Gay Liberation Front, formed shortly after the Stonewall Riots.
Yep.
And originally, in their manifesto, they're sort of like, we support transgender people and diverse identities, and our focus is not going to be on, the rights of gay men, which was similar for very many other groups at the time. But then I think it was like within a few years, they had actually sort of like moved away from that. That was not so much a priority. And there was a point where Sylvia was like, they were not giving her the microphone, and eventually she tore it away and made it very clear that if it wasn't for the transgender people of color, you wouldn't be here. It's also a nice thing because well, not a nice thing, because the other aspect is like I think STAR that Sylvia and Marcia started shortly after. Like not a lot of people actually realize that it was sort of like a community for getting trans and people of color off the streets, but also it was literally financed by sex work.
Yeah, absolutely. These are very important facts that are overlooked. And I think that falls in line with the desire to celebrate as opposed to protest. And this is where it is interwoven with people's understanding of Pride today. People want to parade, they don't want to march in protest without seeing how the two can come together. And I think that what you're talking about is, well, it's very, very relevant. Homelessness continues to affect particularly LGBTQ people of colour. If you look at even Stonewall statistics, they make up quite a high percentage of the young people that they help.
Yes. Yeah, and so it's and so it's sort of like if we look at it, like the 60s was sort of seen as like this big like sexual revolution, and so you had like this big spark of all these very strong feminist movements are pushing for rights of women, and then the Gay Liberation Front actually sort of spread off over into Europe, and there's still like a lot of collaboration there that we're actually able to get a lot of laws passed for rights for like for LGBT people, but focus mostly on the lesbian gay side. And what are your thoughts about that, as far as like how there were these huge movements that happened, but at the same time we also had heavy discrimination towards minority communities and people of color?
Okay, I think for one thing we really need to differentiate between lesbian and gay, because I think that it's important to say that lesbian erasure is huge.
Yes.
For example, 1963 Arena 3, if I asked a lot of people, they wouldn't know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a very important magazine that was one of the UK's first ever magazines to be, getting myself tongue-tied here. It was essentially a lesbian and women's rights magazine and became Sappho, This is fantastic history. And when you look at the networks that were being created via that and how it interwove with the wider women's movement, this is a fantastic history that continues to be erased. Now, if you look at the words of, say, Audre Lorde, who everyone sort of loves to quote from, she talks about, I actually wrote down a quote from her. She states that the existence of Black, gay, but particularly lesbian people were not allowed to cross public consciousness in America. So I think that often when we talk about gay and lesbian liberation, there needs to be a differentiation between them. I think that, particularly I'm thinking here from a Black perspective, the role of Black gay men has widely been written out of the history of gay liberation. If you look at the films made by Marlon Riggs, who's an American filmmaker who unfortunately passed away from AIDS, his films very, very beautifully portray the intersection of being Black, of being gay, and having AIDS. And this history, so if you look at the scholars, say Patrick Johnson, or in Canada, you could look at Ronaldo Walcott, they look at the Black male role in the AIDS movement, which I mean, when I talk to other people about this, they sort of glaze over, like they didn't really know that there was any kind of black gay role.
I'm honestly not surprised by that.
I'm not surprised, but I am outraged by it.
yeah, it's sort of like a commonality where we see constant erasure of the people who actually do a lot of the heavy lifting and work, and it's sort of because we have to have a for the masses, you know, for the general working class and such. Sorry, I'm getting a little socialist here. But so we sort of like when we're trying to like bring about movement and fight for equal rights, you sort of have to like present this very nice polished sanitary image for people to buy into. And historically speaking, it's always been sort of like white people, and it has to be a white male due to patriarchal standards. Then becomes white gay man.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and this is quite a difficult one. Hopefully I won't have people hitting out of the Zoom chat on this.
So my personal opinion is, if we make people uncomfortable, it's good.
Okay. Yes, as long as they stick with it, though. I've made people uncomfortable and they've left. That's not great. Yeah. Often the faces that are held up in the gay liberation movement have been faces that continue to be to the detriment of Black and BAME. I don't love that term, but BAME people. Yeah. So, for example, Peter Tatchell is very damaging to queer people of colour. He kind of promotes this very homo-imperialist and homo-nationalist rhetoric.
Yeah, so for people who don't know Peter Tatchell, could you sort of like shine some light on who that is?
Yeah, so if you research GLF and if you research his role as a human rights and a gay activist, and he continues today. I'm not saying that his foundation doesn't do any good, but he has a tendency to portray, for example, Uganda and Jamaica, which I'll come on to later on in this talk, as being violently homophobic, with no agency on the ground and in desperate need of help from the West. Furthermore, he has been kind of embroiled into the nationalist rhetoric against Muslims. And definitely, I think a lot of the Islamophobia I've heard in the gay community is furthered by such activists.
Yes, and that's, yeah, I've seen that myself, because I was born Muslim, but now I'm agnostic. But I've seen that very much towards it's like this because Islamophobia is so acceptable within society, it's able to sort of like permeate itself into spaces, you know, for queer people, and then you have like queer Muslim people who just don't feel comfortable going to any spaces at all.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which is weird, because actually they're the ones who go to events the most. Okay,
that I didn't know. But
yeah, I was doing a little reading. So basically talking about like queer people of color, and then also cis gay people. When it comes to actually attending events, the people of color or BIMA tend to be the ones who attend events the most. However, they're always in the minority within those events.
Yes, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I do see what you're saying.
Yeah. So I'm saving the next step of that for a later topic. Okay. Yes. So in regards to the historical aspect, so you mentioned, so before we start, you kind of mentioned you want to sort of touch upon the colonial aspects and how that's influenced things.
Oh yes. Okay.
If you would like to.
You said it can be, no, absolutely. You said this can be an organic conversation. Okay, a lot of the racism actually I do just want to say a disclaimer. Obviously, I cannot speak for all queer Black people. However, I am representing quite a large body, because I have talked to, actually before this conversation, just over email, just to get some other voices. However, you might know some people who completely disagree with me or haven't had these experiences. A lot of the racism that I've experienced in the queer scene comes from this idea of Black homophobia, i.e. that Black people are just inherently homophobic, almost as if there's something homophobic in this, and that we are all from these kind of countries that are just vilifying homosexuality. Furthermore, even in relation to George Floyd's death, I've encountered racist comments such as, could you ask Black people to stop calling us batty boys? Could you ask Black people to stop voting for right-wing governments en masse in relation to George Floyd's killing?
Mm-hmm.
Whites, queer, whether they're history months, whether they're events, whether they're books, whether they're magazines, whether they're articles, need to educate the communities on how colonialism has come to inform people in, say, the Commonwealth countries or countries that have faced colonialism, how it's come to inform their understanding of colonialism, of sexuality and of gender identifications. So when I was in Vancouver, I was very happy to kind of understand BIPOC, like the Black Indigenous people of colour, and particularly through talking to two people that I knew, I was really able to understand how the role of the church during colonialism stripped away two-spirit identities, stripped away the actual matriarchal ways of society, and it was not before the colonialism. We were looking at societies that were much more fluid, less nuclear family, less patriarchal. And so when I'm hearing the kind of rhetoric that is coming from the LGBT communities laced with judgment, I'm realizing there's a whole history of your own responsibility that you need to understand and take on board. And perhaps if they could kind of acknowledge that and understand it, they might stop being so racist to us in the present.
Yes, yeah, and that's an excellent point, because I was sort of seeing like before this past month, it's sort of always like over like many years, I've always talked to people saying like you have to acknowledge the privilege that you have, that it doesn't mean that what you've done you don't deserve it. It means you benefited from this systematic oppression that has existed for centuries.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time the response I get is like, well, I wasn't around centuries ago, so why should I be responsible for that?
Yes, this is great when this kind of question is posed to us. I think we need to understand that these systems of oppression continue into the present day, and anti-Black racism globally essentially exists as a scar of slavery, and you may not feel responsible for that, but you are privileged by that, and you cannot just shake that privilege because you don't really want it. And I think in acknowledging that you have that privilege demands a responsibility of you to do your best to counter it, if that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, no, that does. Yeah, that kind of steps into like we're like anti-racism, which has finally become a common thing to talk about. But I kind of want to steer us back to LGBT really fast, so we can actually finish up that topic. Sorry. So bring that into in like a current context, with the current LGBT communities. And so one of the things that I'm seeing is a total lack of intersectionality within the LGBTQ culture. Where it's basically, there's usually a big focus on, like same-sex marriage and adoption rights.
Yep.
Now, how do you think that, BAME, I don't really like BAME, I'm sorry. I wrote down BAME, but I'm not really liking it. Okay.
Yeah, I know, I'm quite, I agree, yes.
Yeah, how do you feel like these communities are actually affected by the lack of intersectionality? Like, I have my own opinions around like transgender rights, but I'd like to hear your perspective.
I think that we're hugely impacted, because if you look historically, a lot of Black liberation fighters were fighting multiple fights. If you look at Audre Lorde, if you look at Angela Davis, if you look at James Baldwin, we have been fighting Black liberation, we've been fighting LGBT liberation, and even the people, like, for example, she's never really spoken about in terms of queer history, and she really should be, Josephine Baker, who was bisexual. she may not have like overtly identified with any kind of LGBT community, however, being known as a bisexual woman in those like very racist times, and I think is definitely very powerful and something to be celebrated. So but we also need to remember the discrimination that would have come with that. So I think we've always been fighting via kind of, if you like, the intersectional prism. So what I've kind of experienced from a lot of queer communities is the love of shouting the word intersectional. It's like heavily plundered in academia and outside, in fact. And, you know, I've been to events where people have said, I'm going to do, you know, like an intersectional poem. And I just sat there with that thinking, my goodness, you've not mentioned race. I'm feeling really outcasted right now, and you are paying no kind of understanding to where this term has come from. And the fact that it wasn't Kimberly Crenshaw that coined it, she coined it, but we're looking way before that. You need to look at like Patricia Hill Collins and Bell Hooks, and really understand that this intersectional understanding is really deeply sedimented in Black consciousness.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for saying that. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a weird thing because it's like I say, I practice intersectional feminism, but it's sort of like that was always what I practiced.
Yes.
Yeah, because it's sort of like when we look at you know, LGBTQ communities or pride communities and such, it's always heavily focused on the perspective of the white cis members, primarily white cis gay men. It's heavily going to be white cis gay men, because if we look at leadership of pride communities, it's typically going to be made up of those individuals.
Absolutely. I quite agree.
Yeah, and so one thing, you know, sort of question to pose to you. We don't have to sort of solve it today, because we're discussing like a lot of the challenges that we're facing, that we have faced historically and today. What type of things do you think could be done to sort of create more representation? And
so glad you've asked me that question. I was hoping for a question like this because I have some very tangible answers. Yes. Okay. There are amazing Black and other ethnic minorities, I should say, queer people that are filmmakers, that are activists, that are writers, that are, you know, academics, that are, I don't know, they're doing their amazing stuff over there. Highlight them. And not because it's a QPOC issue or a theme of this month, so then next month I'm not going to see them. Because even if you're doing maybe ableism, or you're looking at queer people that are neurodiverse, why would that not include people of colour? Okay, you need to be representing a very underrepresented community. And although we can talk about the problems of representation and that it can become very tokenistic, especially when I think of young people, and I think about the fact that I never saw any people of colour in the queer history that I was desperately trying to kind of get my hands on, it's very damning and very damaging. And I think that, yes, you need to show these people. A second thing to come on to, it's absolutely true that the Black trans community and Black and Latinx trans communities continue to face unprecedented levels of violence and murders. However, with that needs to come positive representation, because what I'm seeing is almost like an Instagram-esque faces of this, like, this trans woman was murdered, this trans woman was murdered, this trans woman is murdered. And I'm wondering, okay, who was this woman? Like, what was her life? Where did she come from? Where was her backstory? I'm not really hearing anything of that. And secondly, the trans community do need to see positive representation coming out of their communities. You know, I spoke with quite a lot of Indigenous people when I was in Canada about, you know, so I don't know if people are familiar with the missing and murdered Indigenous women. If not, then that's some history that you need to do some research into. However, there's amazing agency and activism happening on the ground, and these people I mean, for me, I found it quite inspiring. How can I think about maybe adopting any of these ways of these approaches, yes, in terms of my own agency and my own activism. I want to hear about that activism that's happening on the ground, not simply the fact that these people have been murdered. And I also think that often people care more about Black bodies in death than they ever did in life. So we do need to remember that, like, Marcia P. Johnson was murdered, and people often don't really bring that point up. So when we're looking at what seems to be the current murders of Black trans women, this is actually a long genealogy. This is a long lineage of Black trans women's bodies not being protected. Furthermore, the way we can help representation, like, Black trans men do exist, and I feel that they are being majorly erased from all forms of representation. And, you know, we really had to push for Toni McDade's killing to be talked about.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I saw that and I was kind of getting upset about it last week. I was like, Toni McDade was a person who was murdered. We're talking about all the other people who are being killed during the riots, but Toni McDade is not coming up. Why not?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen some queer platforms have included stories on him, but again, I've seen like extremely racist comments in relation to this, and extremely insensitive comments. And I think this is relevant to say in relation to murders of Black people. Often people will comment, and I've experienced this in life, it's not just like trolls on the internet, like I've experienced this kind of thing in life, like, that person was not a hero, they did this and that. I shouldn't have to be Jesus not to be murdered.
Yes, that's something. God, I'm getting all fired up about this. But it's something that comes up like every single time there's a murder. There's always something coming in and say, like, oh, well, see, they got caught for shoplifting, and they did this and this, and this was on the record. I'm like, you're not trying to offer perspective. You're offering justification for murder.
Yeah, exactly, absolutely. And we must remember the difference in media portrayal when white people kill and when Black people are even murdered. Because, for example, even in Nova Scotia, there was a recent mass shooting, and the way it was narrated in the media was so sympathetic to the shooter, telling us about how lonely he was and how isolated he was, and that he had this fascination with like the police, so maybe he like wasn't mentally stable. That narrative would have not had any of that should it have been a Black man.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if we look at current times, I think it was, 2 days ago in Virginia, there was the man who drove into a crowd, got out and started shooting people before he was subdued by a Black person, who ended up being the head of the KKK community in the area. And he wasn't arrested by the police. He surrendered to them and walked over to them.
Okay.
And that's and like how drastic the treatment is of Black people and white people, especially even when it comes to like crime or innocence.
Yes, absolutely. And so on this point, if we look at the socioeconomic conditions for Black people in a society, when we look at the health inequalities for people in society, perhaps we start to understand. I'm by no means trying to victimize people, but perhaps we kind of understand how people can fall into such lifestyles. But there's sort of people almost want to ignore all of that and just focus on this one crime that happened without contextualizing it in the slightest. And I think that through representing inequalities, we can help to counter that.
Okay, good. Yeah. Gosh, you just kind of like put me like a moment of like, there's so many things I want to say, but I can't find one thing to say properly.
Do you have an answer to that question though? Do you think that there's tangible things that could be done?
It's similar to what you said. So I find that one of the big challenges we face is that when we're speaking to an audience about the challenges and discrimination we face and we deal with, the audience is receptive. However, that audience is a minority. You know, it could be an audience of all white people, but those white people are still a minority in that white community.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and so what I find is the only way to actually have a tangible change is for allies to actually not just, you know, give us a space to speak and make our voices heard, but to actually take what we're saying and pass it on to others who are not as receptive in order to actually, you know, open their eyes.
Yes. Okay. Yes. I know. I really, really like that point. Absolutely. Yes. I think that it's absolutely true. I mean, if you look at women's liberation and the continued, shall we say, struggle that patriarchal views are inflicting, I think men listen to men very well, and my feminist friends that are male continue to work actually within their communities. Yes, I think that white people taking off that labour from people of colour's shoulders would be great. And it would also be great if we can sometimes be represented about something that has nothing to do with our activism, but is to do with like maybe some of our other talents in the ways that white queer people are represented.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Because even it's like we need to have more representation of like people like, so like we are more than our struggle and our fight. Like it's a really obvious thing, but it's not that commonly understood.
No.
Yeah, so like in Munich, gosh, I've been to, so like in Munich, I go to queer events all the time. I have met 2 Black people. Like that's it. Now those two people are actually, they're artists and performers.
Yeah.
And so usually what they're doing now, they're working towards getting more event spaces to perform in and such. But for them, it's actually a struggle because a lot of the time they're actually being said like, okay, well, you can come in and perform for free. And they're like, well, I'm an artist, you know, I need to be paid for this. This is my living, this is my job.
Absolutely.
All those spaces will work with white artists to be like, okay, yeah, we're totally going to pay you this much per hour, you know, and here's a contract, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so these people of color have to actually sort of like fight to actually be treated as an actual professional artist who gets paid.
There you go, absolutely. And I think what you're saying kind of touches also upon when we have to have the talk with white queer people about white privilege, and they think that because they are oppressed in other manners, i.e. maybe they are facing homophobia, that they do not have white privilege. And then you can use an example like the one you've just given to show, look, we are not trying to disqualify your experiences, but in that situation you are being privileged because of your race.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and like there is like Munich is possibly the worst space for any of this because it's like the city of white privilege where you only come here if you want to be rich and white. There's probably listeners here who are probably from Munich and they're just like, hang on a second. But really look around and it becomes incredibly apparent. So yeah, so I know in other cities, they're actually doing much better where there actually are spaces where there's people of color who are performers, they're artists, they're speakers. Even in the corporate world, you know, we have slowly a little more progress there. Long way to go. But it's like it's slowly happening, but also people need to be there has to be like a stronger push that they need to actually acknowledge that we have, I don't know, we have skills, we have talents, we are actually people outside of this horrible civil rights struggle that you just read about once when you're like 12 years old.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I just wanted to come back actually, if I'm thinking whilst I'm listening to you, to one of your earlier questions about what can be done to help with representation. I think that white communities need to understand themselves and then acknowledge and represent the ways in which Black bodies were actually ostracized from villages, because I still think a lot of, when I'm talking to queer communities, you know, people are still understandably heavily invested in the history and villages and the activism that came out of the villages. And I think people need to understand, and there's scholarship out there, and you don't have to be in the academy to read it, it's not all esoteric. There's scholarship out there that does clearly delineate the ways in which Black people were pushed out of these villages. And I think that's important to be represented.
Okay. Absolutely. Okay. All right, let me see this chart. Okay, so that actually just kind of brings me into current world events and what is happening right now. Like the Black Lives Matters movement. I know this is a lot for the two of us to talk about.
Yeah, it's total.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to like sort of start us off with like a conversation that I had with a friend last year.
Okay.
And if she's listening, yes, we're friends. Deal with it. So last year I was in London talking to a friend about spaces, Black spaces in particular, and at the time we couldn't agree on whether or not allies should be included in those Black spaces. Like I felt that they should, like we should absolutely allow allies to take part in spaces. They should just know that they're not the ones who are supposed to speak, they're supposed to listen.
Okay.
However, now for me, after like the past month and realizing all my friends are white, I now actually completely agree with them, and that there is totally a need for us to have like spaces, Black spaces where it's just for Black people of color and minorities. And what are your thoughts about that?
Okay, girl, I would have schooled you. I'd have educated you on why the need for, yes. Okay. I love, so Rainbow Noir, who are an amazing, they are it's LGBTIQA plus organisation for people of colour up in Manchester.
Mm-hmm.
Their events are solely for people of colour, and then they do events for significant others, friends, families, allies and supporters. This to me is very, very important, because what happens so often in our spaces is kind of like a white takeover, in which white people are just like up with their hands and taking over with their voices, and the people of colour, because we've been so silenced in other kind of in our day-to-day lives, sometimes we have a tendency to do this and kind of let it happen and then feel gruntled afterwards. Sometimes people might literally call them out. But for example, okay, in Vancouver, I went to an exhibition, and it was Cyrus Marcus Ware, who's a fantastic, he's involved in Black Lives Matter Toronto, and he's a Black trans man, and Kona, who's a poet and activist in Vancouver. And they actually said in the question time afterwards, okay, white folk, we just want to take some questions from like Black people, because the white audience were literally bombarding them with questions, and these kinds of reasons elucidate on why we need our own spaces. Also, I think that in terms of strategizing, often we need to strategize by ourselves, and so we can, even though we're very heterogeneous and there are so many different experiences and opinions and identities, we can come and form like a kind of united message that we can communicate with, which I think is not always going to happen if we have people outside of our communities. And I think also allies need to understand that they aren't us, and while it's amazing what they are doing, they too have privilege, and they too need to make concessions, and they might need to kind of give something up, like it did happen at a Black Lives Matter event, that like a load of white folk at the event were like really annoyed and disgruntled that they like weren't given like t-shirts that said Black Lives Matter. And I'm like, the fact that you're even having a tantrum about that precisely shows that like you're not committed to the Black struggle. You're centering this, like,
that's
however, yeah,
infuriating. Sorry, that's just infuriating to see that they're so upset. I'm like, I didn't get my badge of inclusion.
Yeah, exactly. Literally my badge of inclusion. Now that doesn't mean I'm not going on some exclusionary route either, and I myself have talked to members of my own community about not being like straight up exclusionary and straight up hostile, because I do think we do need unity. And as you were saying so well earlier, about like white people educating other white people, well, that's only going to happen if we're working together. Furthermore, you know, we do need to acknowledge interracial relationships, and if we are completely outcasting allies, we may kind of outcast members of our own communities who are in interracial relationships.
Okay. Okay, I agree. Okay, so I think we're running close to the end of our time.
Okay.
So I kind of wanted to open this up to questions from everybody here. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat to Alex, I think, and then Alex, I believe, will pass them along to us. Yes, yes. Send your questions to Alex, and then he'll send them along to us. Yeah. Okay. While we're waiting, because I was like, there's one topic that I wanted to really get to with the current day, which was like the anti-racism and what people should be doing. Because the reason I had this disagreement last year was due to the fact that all my friends were allies and they understood how to actually step back and let me speak.
Okay.
And a lot of the times they're actually sort of like, they should like push me to the front, be like, you need to be the one who's actually seen in this. And then actually over the past month, I've seen like, that's not the case for everybody. Like I've been bombarded with questions. Like there was a march or this demonstration this past weekend. And I told people, like, I'm going to go to be with Black people. And I was just being like constantly being pinged with messages being like, Ken, where are you? Da, 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 da.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so one of the things I found was the demonstration was led by Black people, amazing talks, speeches, performances, everything, but it still felt very performative. And so, crap, we got our first question.
I just saw that, yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, so what are your thoughts about like how, because we started talking about what people can do, but as far as like anti-racism, what should they be doing for themselves? And then we'll jump into this question.
Okay, I do think, yeah, educating yourself as much as possible, whether it, so I know like there's been this drive to like read, so I would recommend myself Renee Edu Lodge's book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. I think, especially people in the UK, any of you UK people are out there, really need to read this. It also steps away from the American narrative, which obviously we're kind of always presented as the kind of Black history. And I think YouTube is a fantastic source. I know it's full of rubbish, but it's also full of some very poignant talks, conversations like the ones we're having. And I think reconciling, if you have any objections to say like the kind of protests that you're seeing, that needs to be kind of investigated by yourself, because I have seen, even with the people that are like kind of like would consider themselves quite radical, have had problems with like the statues coming down and stuff. Yeah.
I have problems with that.
So I've seen the question. So yeah, I would recommend, actually, it was a documentary called The Salt Mines, and it was brought out the same year as Paris is Burning, and it also would I read the question? Eve, can you read it? I'm not great.
Yes, yeah, sorry, I'll read the question. So you mentioned Paris is Burning. Are there any documentaries or films you would recommend on any of these topics?
Yeah, so I would definitely recommend Salt Mines, which was filmed the same year as Paris is Burning, and it actually is surrounds the lives of some Black and Latinx trans women who live on a salt mine, essentially. And I think what I really admire about this documentary, and Jose Munoz, who's was, unfortunately he's no longer with us, was a queer academic, he also writes a bit about this. It really depicts the realities, not through the lens of pageantry, not through the lens of celebration, and you're really able to understand the exclusions of these women. And I think that will give you a good context of the lives that the people depicted in Paris Burning were also living. But also I would recommend reading Is Paris Burning by Bell Hooks, which was written in 1992. Again, don't worry about, I promised myself today I would not recommend any esoteric texts. So don't worry, nothing is inaccessible that I'm recommending. So this, I believe it is on Google. I think it's actually available as a free PDF, and if not, if anyone does want it, I am able to basically get it. I think I have it on one of my drives, and I can make it available.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so I want to throw out one actually. So on the theme of Paris is Burning, because Paris is Burning is heavily about the ballroom scene, queer ballroom scene, and how it formed. From talking to a couple of house mothers, there actually is a lot of controversy around Paris is Burning itself because it didn't actually benefit the community. Like basically it was sort of like these filmmakers, they went in, they interviewed, they taped them, but they didn't actually, but nobody actually got anything from the film itself. So there's another one that came out several years ago called Kiki.
Okay.
Which is actually phenomenal because they work with the community to understand and see what's going on, and the people who took part in also benefited from the film itself. So I would highly recommend looking at that. Another one, sorry, I'm like really into the ballroom scene. Is this mini series called My House.
Oh yes.
That is amazing. There's a couple episodes actually talking about what it means to be a trans man in the Black community.
Very good.
And I highly recommend checking that out also.